Even though like I'm doing the job 18 years, like I'm still learning.
So nice to come on to what you do and just see you speak so plainly about subjects that are really, really complex.
That's it.
Growing up, and I'm going through my mental health problems, Joe's going through his, we didn't have anyone to relate to. Guest today, Dr. Mark Rackley. Thanks for coming on.
Yay!
Pleasure to finally meet you. It's a pleasure to finally meet you.
Likewise.
Can you
Virtual
tell-
friends.
Yeah,
Jumping into the
virtual
real
friends.
world.
We spoke a while ago,
Yes.
probably like 3 months ago, and it's nice to figure out a date where we can probably
Yes.
set this up. And there's so much information coming for you guys. We've got tons planned on men's mental health. We've got ADHD and the myths of ADHD, toxic masculinity. We got so much more. But first off, obviously we know a lot about you, but for the viewers and listeners out there, can you share a bit about your story and what you do?
Yes. So thank you, lads, for having me on.
No worries.
Pleasure.
Big fan of your work. So I'm a psychologist. I'm an adolescent and adult psychologist. So my area is mental health. So I'm from Dublin. I did all my training in Dublin, and I worked in Dublin for a little bit, and then I moved over to the UK 14 years ago. Yeah. And I spent 7 of those years working for the NHS in adult mental health services. And then the last 7 years, I have my own practice in Southwest London. So in my own practice now, I see teenagers, I see adults, and I cover all areas of mental health that you kind of would expect a psychologist to cover. So I treat patients with depression, PTSD, OCD, eating disorders, autism, ADHD, like all the stuff that covers mental health, I treat. And my patients range from 13 up to, I think my oldest patient's 86.
Really?
So, yeah. So
That's
I cover
awesome.
like the whole
board.
lifespan.
Everything, yeah.
Yeah. And it's great. I love it. I love it because it's always interesting when you're working with people because obviously no two people are the same and no two people's experience of mental health is the same. So even though like I'm doing the job 18 years, like I'm still learning because there's so much about the brain we don't know. And I learned so much from my patients about their stories and what it was like for them and how did they end up having this particular problem. So, that's what I'm doing
Hey,
now.
that's great.
Busy.
I can't wait to get into it all. One thing I wanted to say first as well is you have your own podcast as well.
I
don't
do
you?
have my own podcast. Yes, I'm trying to. The thing when you do my job is I kind of do this. I sit in a room with another person, and I have a very private conversation with them, and it's great, but it's very contained, and I kind of felt, well, therapy's great, but it's only great for the people that are in therapy. But if you're not in therapy or you're afraid to go to therapy or you can't afford it or whatever it might be, then I kind of felt like, well, I kind of need to take it outside of my office and put it on a bigger platform. And my patients are hilarious. They're like, oh, could you recommend a podcast to listen to? And I'm like, well, not for what you're asking me
that's
for,
funny,
no. So I just thought, oh, listen,
Make your own.
do it myself. So
Brilliant. That's great.
so I'm fortunate enough. I know loads of doctors who are brilliant at what they do. So I basically just rounded up my mates and said, right, you're an expert on anorexia. Let's
Get
have
you
a
on.
Let's have a chat.
Such a great idea.
So I've just brought all my mates on
Yeah.
to talk about and that's the great thing I suppose about the podcast is it's doctors talking to doctors.
Yeah, that's important.
It's conversations
as
we'll be having anyway.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
But the public wouldn't get to hear that. Like, unless you're in a doctor's office, you won't hear that conversation. So I just thought, well, like, we're not like practicing magic in our offices. So I wanted just to bring those conversations out because I felt they were really important that that everybody could hear that stuff. So
I think that's what I love most about it, actually, is that we'll talk about social media, I'm sure, later on. But I think what I found most refreshing from the stuff that I saw of you is that social media is just full of nonsense. As again, we'll
So
come on
full
to.
of rubbish.
It's so nice to come on to what you do and just see you speak so plainly about subjects that are really, really complex.
that's it.
That it was a sort of that breaking that stigma between what can be really awkward conversations and just having someone who's actually in the field themselves talk about it so plainly. It was just it was fantastic to see that. Yeah.
But I felt that was so important though, Joe, like because loads of times I was like, what do you do? I'm like, well, I'll tell you what I do. Like and I think it just takes away all that, like, mystery. It normalizes.
Massively
Like
so.
this is like if you have a mental health problem and you come and see a psychologist, this is what we're going to talk to you about, and this is how we're going to try and help you understand it. So I wanted to make it accessible, but also I do feel, and I get into it, that there's a lot of resistance sometimes about coming to see us because people are afraid. So I wanted to take all that stuff. There's nothing to be afraid of. You know, we're not dragons.
No, well, that's the thing. I think it's that. I think
It is intimidating.
it is. When you
Oh,
hear
it's hugely intimidating.
when you hear
yeah.
psychologist, it sounds scary, right? It's
Oh,
a really
Lord.
intimidating word. I'm
Yeah.
sure you hear that all the time. I think
Like,
when you hear
tend
that,
not to tell people what I do for a living
Yeah.
because I
because as
like
soon as you do, the walls
slowly
come
moving
down.
away from me.
Yeah, chip away at them gradually.
What's
I love
your
that.
what's your sort of view on podcasting in the mental health space as a whole? Like, do you reckon there should be more of them?
Yeah,
or,
definitely.
Yeah, that's what we've spoken about this so many times.
Definitely. I just feel like there's so much to cover. Like I'm doing my podcast a year and I've got 25 episodes and I haven't even scratched the surface of what I need to talk about and the people I need to bring on, because the whole field is massive. Like it's just massive. And like you could spend hours talking about one subject. So I do feel like there's definitely I think there's more conversations that need to be had, and that's why like I love coming on like your podcast, because you guys aren't doctors. You're two guys who are talking about mental health, so you're relatable in terms of, you know, people will see you guys and think, great, you know, I see myself in those guys, but like they can't relate to me because they're not psychologists. So I think the blending of that is brilliant.
Yeah, agreed. That's kind of why we started as well. Is we were like, when we were growing up and I'm going through my mental health problems, Joe was going through his, is we didn't have anyone to relate to. That was the main reason we did episode 1, was we just wanted to be that for someone else because we didn't have it. And now, as you said, collabing with people like yourself who know 10 times more than we do. We just know from experience and what we've looked at and what we lived through. This is what you've literally done your whole life. And it's like, in my opinion, something so like beautiful in that connection where you can have someone who knows everything and also two guys that have lived through it and still live through it and those different aspects. And I don't think you get that from anything else other than a podcast or maybe a YouTube video. And that's why I think there should be so many more mental health podcasts as a whole. We always say this, it's just there's not like, in my opinion, it's not like a competition. It's like, just do it, like please just do it.
Totally. I think as well, like some doctors are, and I get it, like because it's our job and our profession and our reputation, they're a little bit afraid to jump into that space, and I understand that. But I think like as long as you're not going to say anything outrageous, then like I don't see how it can be a bad thing.
I agree. And we did a bit of research and we saw you on Big Brother as the resident psychologist on Big Brother in 2012.
In another life.
How was that as an experience?
It was what you'd imagine it would be. For anybody that's watched Big Brother, it was great fun.
Yeah,
I was supposed to say that from the outset. It was great fun. It was very different because I'd never done live TV and I'd never done commentary, but for me it was a fascinating experience because I'd sit in front of my telly like every night watching Big Brother, and I was taking notes on what was going on and what I was observing, and then we'd have a meeting on Friday with the production team and the editors, and we'd say, well, listen, I'm going to talk about this on Sunday, and like fine, and then we go up to the studios and we'd record it live, and it was fascinating because something like that, it's like Big Brother, certainly back then, it was massive.
Huge.
And everyone was watching it. And I found it really interesting as well because you could see all the kind of, it was a big psychological experiment when you put all these people in this confined space, but then you start to give them all these different tasks, and you'd start to see, well, people used to forget that they were in the house because that became their normality, and you could see that they would change in terms of adapting to the space. So fascinating stuff. Yeah. And I'm looking back, I'm so glad I did it because
that's such a cool thing.
Like, and what an experience. Exactly.
Do you find a lot of people struggled in there?
Oh, you had,
Yeah.
Because we would.
Was there more behind the scenes that like wouldn't go on TV?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, totally. Yeah. Totally. So they would obviously edit it for television, but part personally, I couldn't do it. I just wouldn't.
I'd hate to do
I
something like
don't
that.
think I could
I don't know
cope
about
with
you,
it
no.
at all, actually, just being locked down like that. So for the people that did do it, I mean, huge respect, because, I mean, that is hard. That is really,
You have to be
really
a certain
hard.
type of person to be able to do that.
Oh,
I think.
totally,
I couldn't think of anything worse.
I generally,
We
me neither.
I can't
Me neither.
imagine
we struggle
it.
enough on social media. Like,
Yeah.
I don't want to really put my life out there on social media. We don't have a choice, and we the people we meet and collect.
I think it's
is
more the
amazing,
confinement,
but,
no
like,
clocks, not knowing what sort of time of the day it is other than the sun above you.
Yeah.
It's that sort of confinement, and it's sort of like more like prison,
Yeah.
like it's sort of being.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
couldn't cope with that at all.
I don't think I
Absolutely
could
And
not.
also
either.
they put it like, and I do like what they do. They put it like a broad spectrum of society in there.
Yeah.
So you could be stuck in the house with somebody you just absolutely
Hate.
detest. Imagine living like that
Coexist
person.
with someone.
Makes
that-
great
yeah.
TV though.
Well, exactly, because
Well,
it
that's
brings
the
the
official- yeah,
conflict.
exactly.
Yeah. What
But-
what kind of changes do you think they've made? Because there's a new series coming out, I think,
Yes,
soon.
Yeah, soon.
there is,
Couple
yeah,
Do you think
yeah.
they've made changes as a result of everything that's been going on in the mental health space to protect the people that are going in there?
Yeah, so there's a lot of talk about that. I think the I don't know now, but I know certainly when I was doing it, the I didn't do the vetting.
Right.
I did the kind of more on-screen stuff, but they do have a vetting process for when people are applying and auditioning. And I think especially because of what happened on Love Island, like that's really kind of come to the
Yeah,
fore now,
absolutely.
where they've really got to protect the people going in there. Because again, like these are, you're putting your whole life out there, and like the aftermath is what you kind of have to.
aftercare as well.
It's
Yeah.
really hard.
Yeah, it's tough.
On the Love Island point, we had Alex Bowen on, who
I've
was
seen that. Yes, I've
so
seen- I
he
watched
was
that.
excellent. He
Yeah.
spoke so well about like Love Island as a whole. But he was saying like in terms of social media and stuff, you need a thick skin
Yeah.
if you do something like that.
Yeah.
But a lot of people don't, and I'm not necessarily someone who has a thick skin for social media.
Mm.
If he got a rude comment, he'd be like, with my ADHD, it really bothers me.
Yeah, yeah.
So if someone
You're
doesn't,
rejection sensitive.
yeah, if someone doesn't have
Yeah.
thick skin and they're doing
Yeah.
something like that, what advice would you give them?
I would think with that, like the thing with social media is, I think it's a little bit like knowing the enemy. So social media, you don't need to be a genius to figure out that there's people who are on there who have very bad mental health, who have an agenda, and who will use it for very nasty means. And I think if you're going to go onto it, you need to be very clear that that's the space you're jumping into. Like there is lovely people on there and there's lovely stuff that can go on, but also there's a really nasty side to it. Like you will
Yeah.
get people that will troll you.
It's
You will
inevitable.
yeah, it's inevitable, absolutely. So I think if you can separate out, well, that's not personal, because it can't be, because the person doesn't know you. But if you're the maybe more sensitive type, or if you struggle with being able to separate out the personal from the fact that this is a stranger, then I think you need to think about being on there.
Did you find that the transition to social media and doing what you're doing now, which is absolutely amazing, did you find that was tough going to social media, or was that quite easy for you?
It's funny. Because of my job, I see the horrors of social media.
Of course, the damage it can do to your clients.
Yeah,
is-
totally.
Yeah.
Because a lot of my patients are teenagers, and
Bullying.
I'm going to do a separate podcast just on this.
Yeah.
Just around the awful things that can happen on social media, the cyberbullying. We'll talk about toxic masculinity later, but all of that stuff that really damages young minds, or can damage young minds.
Yeah.
So I was very careful jumping onto it, and I needed to really kind of think about, what am I doing here, and what's my motive, and what's my message going to be. So when I opened the account last year, that is the very first social media account I've ever had.
Really?
Yeah, I didn't exist, literally.
Okay.
Yeah.
But that because of what you did for a living, you wanted to stay
Yeah.
separate.
I want to
Okay.
say completely separate, but
understand
also I needed to be careful, because
course.
if I was going to put myself out there, my patients would see it,
Absolutely.
my colleagues would
I
see
was
it.
thinking that.
Yeah, and so I needed to really think, what am I doing here, and very, very tight boundaries around what I do on social media. So it's personal because it's about me, but I'm not what the account is about. It's about mental health.
Love that. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
so
amazing.
you never see me showing you pictures of my dinner. Like I'm not. That won't
Yeah,
happen.
that's not what you're there.
It's about mental health, so it's not.
Yeah.
I'm just the vehicle. It's the message.
Yeah.
So once I kind of got
Yeah.
that right in my head, I
Yeah.
thought, jump. But I did it like with a. I was a little bit
I love
nervous.
that.
You were saying about young people having a lot of problems on social
Yeah.
media. What's your kind of view as a whole of the mental health in the UK at the moment?
Shocking.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's bad.
Why do you reckon that is? Like, we've talked about this a few
Yeah.
times. Obviously, we're not experts in
Yeah.
it, but from your point of view, why is the mental health in the UK so bad?
At the moment, and this is just purely anecdotal from, say, my experience of the work that I do, and I suppose talking to my colleagues as well. The pandemic was a whopper. Yeah, an absolute whopper. Yeah.
We had a study here that we were going to read out to you. That was literally going on to the next part. Was the Health Foundation think tank says mental illness has increased more than 400% among 16 to 34-year-olds over the last 10 years. We were looking at the NHS direct figures last week on our podcast, and it showed the sharp increase in mental illness in all age groups since the pandemic, and we're blown away to see a 23% increase for 25 to 39-year-olds. And that was going to lead on to the question, why has there been such a awful increase since the pandemic? What's your view there? More just like social anxiety type thing, or is it
not even? Do you know, we saw, because of the demographic I work with, Tom, massive increase in self-harming and eating disorders.
eating disorders?
Yeah.
What type of things are like? Is that not anxiety? That's anorexia and
bulimia.
Bulimia.
But predominantly anorexia. So I don't know if you know much about eating disorders, but eating disorders it becomes about food, but it's not about food. It's about the relationship with food changing in order for you to be able to cope with whatever you're struggling with. So the pandemic for teenagers, or for everybody, was hard. But for lots of teenagers, they struggled with the lack of socialization. They struggled with not seeing their friends. And young minds are fragile minds because they haven't been around long enough and they haven't developed coping mechanisms. So that's why self-harm is so high in teenagers, is because it's a very easy way to get pain relief. But obviously it's not. And I've got if you want to listen, I've got an amazing episode on my podcast about this. I just talk about self-harm with one of my colleagues. But what we saw is, again, like us all, young people were struggling to cope during the pandemic. And we saw a huge spike in what we would see as more teenage coping mechanisms or teenage disorders. So massive rise in self-harming and a massive rise in eating disorders as well. Big rises too in anxiety and also in depression as well. So, I mean, you see those all the time doing the work anyway, but certainly during COVID, post-COVID, big spike up. Yeah.
Do you reckon that a big part of that's sort of being stuck inside as well?
Oh, totally. It's not normal.
No. We said a point, Gary Bracker, I'm not sure if you heard of Gary Bracker, he's like a human, calls himself a biohacker, but he's basically works on making your body perform at its best. And he was saying, looking through studies, people are supposed to be outside from ancestral times 85% of the time and inside 15%, and at the moment we're inside 97% of the time and only outside 3%. And he was like, it doesn't have to be 85%, but finding a right balance that's like strikes between, so you're not just inside, because you go to work undercover, your cars could be in the garage, your bedroom's inside, you know, you go to the supermarket, which is inside, you come home, you cook inside. And he was just saying, even if it's just being out and about, and that's what Joe and I preach a lot, is just being outside. And you said something where you were like, you don't necessarily need to do 10,000 steps a day. Like, a lot of people don't have the time to do that. It's being outside. Like, if you have a 10-15 minute break at lunch, take it, go outside, just put your phone down or take it with you, just be outside. And you said that on a few episodes ago, and it always kind of stuck with me, is it's hard to find that balance. But I reckon the pandemic ruined that for so many more people as well. Not having gardens. If you're in a flat, what are you supposed to I took it for granted that we had a nice garden to go in and stuff, but a lot of people had it so much worse than what we did.
It was tough. It was very, very hard. Obviously I was working through the pandemic, and I work in a medical centre, so there's loads of doctors in the building. And we spent a year in our offices looking at screens, treating our patients. I mean, for us, it was just,
It must be weird.
I was just holding my nerve.
Yeah, I bet.
How'd you do this?
Yeah.
You're not trained to do that. Like you have your patients come into your office and that you're talking to them, but no, but we weren't even allowed to mix with each other.
We hope you enjoyed part 1 of 3 of this episode. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you are, please leave us a kind rating. It helps us more than you'll ever know. Here's a bit of what you can expect in part 2. A lot of people, like my friends and stuff, are like, yeah, I must have ADHD. Like,
They can be hurt really easily. They can find it hard to regulate their emotions.
having someone to hold me accountable.
Yeah.
So in my case, it's my dad mainly.
Yeah.
He's like, Tom,